Well, again, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to speak to your audience. And yeah, this is, in case you haven't heard of it before, this is I guess, our initiative. It's called the Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training. And it really, I guess it stemmed, I'll go into more detail shortly, but it's a book and a course, and it stems from I guess, a passion in this area that myself and my colleague, Martin Bescheid, have had for many, many years. And just so you know, we're extending, due to this conference, we're extending our discount in the course. And the discount course code is HIIT Science 40. You get 40% off any of the course products. Okay, I'll come back to that later. But yeah, we're approved by all of the major governing bodies in the world for sports science, and you can see those there. And please follow us on our socials. Well, let's get into the story. It really started from my passion as in the sport of triathlon. I really started as what I call a semi-pro, and I just fell in love with the sport of triathlon. That was the one that really spoke to me, and spent too many years ultimately trying to become a professional in that. Went to the World Championships in Hawaii a few times, did many Ironmans, but for whatever reason didn't work out. Well, so what do you do when you can't become a professional? Of course, you go to sports science. And I'm coming at you from British Columbia, Canada. So I grew up in Vancouver, and then after doing my studies in the area of I guess endurance sports, I moved to Australia, where the Australian Institute of Sport were doing very well at that time. Did my PhD at the University of Queensland in Australia. Then did lots of work at Edith County University and for the Australian Institute of Sport. That was about 10 years. Got poached by the New Zealand Olympic program and went to New Zealand and led their Olympic program in combination with the AUT University, the physiology program. And that was for another 2 Olympic cycles to, I guess, really develop experience at both understanding both the science and the application of that science in sport, before returning to Revelstoke, where I'm at now, which is a ski town in British Columbia. That's where I'm coming at you from. So that's my short history of who I am. But really, the science and application of high intensity interval training with Martin and I really started at Edith County University in Perth, Australia, where Martin and I got together. We really wanted to start solving this puzzle. How can we use I guess, knowledge of science of interval training to apply it appropriately in sport? And that began a series of studies that culminated with many others, obviously, in 2 very popular literature reviews in sports medicine, which were have the same name ultimately. And because of the popularity, the publisher Human Kinetics came to us and said, please write a book on that. We said, okay. And we also brought in 20 experts in various different sports to tell us how they actually apply the science. And that's what the book has actually become, the book and the course. So if you like what you hear and see here, please follow us on our socials and consider signing up. I'll take you through just the general Coles notes, the outline of the entire program. So Martin and I take us through generally 10 science chapters to begin, which I'll go through a few of those today. And then we get our 20 world experts in the various different sports to come and tell us how they actually apply these concepts within their specific sport. It's one thing to have the science, but it's another thing to actually apply that science, as we all know. That's why we're here. So I'll start with, I guess, going through chapter 1 and just start with a basic definition of what is high intensity interval training. And it is, I guess, defined as exercise consisting of repeated bouts of high intensity work that are performed in your red zone ultimately, or above that lactate threshold or critical power, critical speed that we just were speaking on the last lecture. So yeah, and it's of course interspaced by periods of low intensity exercise or complete rest. And what's been found is that by performing high intensity work above that critical power, which you couldn't hold for an indefinite amount of time, by separating it with brief rests and recovery, we can perform more high intensity work. And of course, there's profound adaptations that we've learned that that can accompany those. So it's an important component to have in just about any sport program, which is why it suits well. But very importantly, it is just one piece of the programming puzzle. You can see there's so many different things that go into performance, so many balls that we have to juggle up into the air. But HIIT itself is often a very important one, and it's a very useful one that if we get a handle on, we can really use as we take it to our sport, if we understand how to use it appropriately. We always say that we must appreciate the context of the situation and the sport that we're involved with before we appreciate the content. So the context is critical. Like, for example, what are the sport demands? What's the athlete profile? Aerobic, anaerobic that's sitting in front of us. It's their psychological state. What are the long-term adaptations that we are after? What are the various different events of the day that we must take into consideration? And the periodization phase. So we should be very clear on all of these first and foremost before we select the content of the HIIT session. And that will get down into the physiological objectives, the metabolism that's involved, the amount of neuromuscular load that's involved, whether we're going to throw some sport-specific skills into that session, et cetera, okay? So context first, and I'll give you a couple examples. So we'll take 3 different sports. The sport that I love, so triathlon, we'll take a rower, and then we'll take the football player. So let's start with a rower. The rower, quite simple. We know that the power that we can produce over 200 meters is directly proportional to the power at your VO2. So more VO2, more power so it's a one-to-one relationship. We need to be very clear on that if we're going to be programming for a rower. We best have some high-intensity work in there. What about for a triathlete? Well, for a triathlete, we can also we can reverse engineer his or her performance as well. And we see that VO2 max and fat max are 2 key things that are associated with race time. So we better have good rates of fat oxidation. We better have a high VO2 max if we're going to train an elite triathlete. And that's my coaching hat on. I train a lot of professional Ironman triathletes. That's my thing. And then the final, so notice here that for any of the, any of these endurance sports that are up here, so cyclists, triathletes, runners, we've got to have very good components, amounts of endurance, and we need to use HIIT appropriately. Note also that this is probably 80% physical, where there's less emphasis in a triathlete, at least, on skills and tactics. So paying attention to HIIT is vital if we're going to have impact in that sport. And then, of course, we can see different relative amounts of speed and strength are going to vary across the different sports. Keep an eye on this football player down here. Let's look at the football player that you guys, your audience is probably most interested in. Well, a fair amount of endurance are going to be required. Strength, maybe not as much, but certainly look at the speed, and the speed is going to be vital. So we best be focusing on a speed element in that physical preparation, but also look up at the amount that's physical, the amount that's skills, the amount that's tactics. Physical it's not the be all end all. This is according to Martin, my colleague, and he really probably values the physical preparation only at 25% relative to the skills and the tactics that we must be of importance for success in football. So if we're going into that sport, we best be aware of that so we can prioritize our resources appropriately. Okay, and I'll just mention that these were put together by all of our experts that are embedded in the world's top sports. They are the ones that chose where their athlete actually landed on this continuum. So let's just take an example here of, this is to tell me how much physical prowess is really going into the success of the football players here. when this is just complete, the skills, the tactics, the spatial awareness. These are things that are very difficult to quantify physically. So we best be aware of that if we're going into that sport and we want to have impact. So fitness, especially in the game of football or soccer, being fitter or faster cannot guarantee success, but being fit and fast not being fit and fast enough can be a problem specific to your position, right? So we need to focus on skills, player interactions, game insights, and decision-making. These are number one in that sport, where secondly, we do need, however, physical capacities to cope with the demands of the match so that players in their position can execute their tactical roles efficiently. So as they all fit in with the game model of that team. Okay, so important to recognize that. Just again, context is key. Here's triathlon, my sport, very physical. I need to make the engine the most important thing. Soccer player, not as much, just important, still important, but we need to recognize the emphasis if we want to have massive impact on our in our sport itself. So, and this is part of the whole relationship that us as sports scientists want to have with coaching staff. Okay, so HIIT is very useful in the fact that HIIT is one of these pieces of the puzzle that we can manipulate so as to not interfere as much with other vital aspects of the programming puzzle. All right, so for example, you can have HIIT sessions, it can be manipulated around in either the soccer player or the runner or triathlete so that it doesn't interfere with some of these other components that may be important for performance, such as strength and speed sessions, and of course, programming the recovery enough. These are all loads, predicted loads, so that we can perform on game day. Okay, so this kind of just advances us up to the chapter 6 in the book, where we're looking at HIIT and concurrent training, or our strength training. And this is done by our colleague, Dr. Jackson Fife, who's from Deakin University in Australia, where he really writes this chapter. He's the expert in this in terms of trying to prevent interference across endurance versus strength sessions. Of course, we know that endurance and strength sessions aren't necessarily compatible. This is termed concurrent training. Endurance training, of course, where it's all about heart and lungs, mitochondria. Strength training, it's about getting bigger, developing power and muscle hypertrophy. So, but are the two necessarily compatible? Probably not. And it really comes down to the influence of the neuromuscular system. You do any types of sessions, especially HIIT, that are going to have a large amount of neuromuscular fatigue that comes with them, it's going to compromise the strength training session, and that which may be important. Conversely, a strength training session for an endurance athlete may also compromise a HIIT session, which could be of most importance for my athletes. So again, important to appreciate this, and I really appreciate the neuromuscular component. Okay, so, and that brings us to our next, we're going in reverse order. We're going to chapter 3 now. This is really what we teach, is using HIIT to hit our physiological targets. So, and as Einstein or someone said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So we break down the physiological response that you can have in your HIIT session into 3 different physiological targets. You can see them there. The first one is the aerobic or the oxidative system. Second one is the anaerobic or the glycolytic lactate system. You can have a very lactic session. And here's the last one, the neuromuscular system. You can have a session that really taxes the neuromuscular system or not. So 3 different targets. You'll see them as green, as red, and black. Okay, so neuromuscular, oxidative, and anaerobic, and that's throughout the whole entire book. From science to application, we identify these as our HIIT types. Okay, so chapter 3 in our physiological targets, we can be targeting things of importance to improve our oxidative metabolism, our ability to use ATP aerobically. So things like your cardiac output, delivery of oxygen by the heart, its oxidative function, your lungs, your respiratory work. This is often, we want a certain amount of time at VO2 max. We're also targeting aerobic enzymes, and to do that, we deoxygenate the muscle levels of oxygen. So these are peripheral and central adaptations, and again, we can focus on those in developing our HIIT sessions to maximize the aerobic system, often very important, especially when we're looking at endurance. This actually brings me to a paper I wrote back in 2010. Should we do high intensity work or should we do big volume work if we want to maximize this system? And I guess in a nutshell, it came down to the realization from the signaling literature that we could get ultimately there were two different roads that led to Rome ultimately, right? So high intensity work, AMPK, it switches on this master switch, and so does high volume training, and both hit the PGC1 alpha, which signals for our muscles to become more oxidative, more type 1 fiber-like, more mitochondria, better at burning fat, better at storing glucose. And so, yeah, two ways to kind of get at it, but which way is the best? We see a lot of our athletes from around the world doing long, slow distance kind of work, doing a lot of long jogs. And, I know there's many sports science practitioners that think, is that really the best means of our time? Could we be, as opposed to doing long runs, could we be doing other things? We would argue that yes, you can. And again, if you pay attention to some of the work that we do in HIIT science, it can be much more efficient with hitting our aerobic targets. Okay, the second target, remember, the red one was our anaerobic contribution. So we can be, affecting these are lactic sessions. They're affecting our, perceived exertion, and can affect our glycogen stocks as well. So this is the second target, and we all know about these ones. And that usually is coupled with the third target, the neuromuscular musculoskeletal strain. All right, and this one is the one that we have to be the most careful with. It's usually the one that leads us to injury. We're talking about the muscle damage, the recruitment. It certainly affects our perceived exertion, and if we don't get it right, we can definitely result in reduced performance and injury. Okay, so those are the three different targets, and the cool thing about HIIT is that you can have different amounts of any of these stimulus if you know how to use the tools, you know how to use the weapons. So this is from my era where Rambo was the guy. I loved Rambo when I was a kid, and he could go in, as opposed to having a weapon of mass destruction. Rambo could go in like a Navy SEAL and just precisely target certain systems. So just like that, we can use that with HIIT. We can go in and just get a session that's aerobic and neuromuscular, not lactic at all, keeping the sympathetic stress at bay. We can have one that doesn't hit the neuromuscular system to prevent injury, and it can just have aerobic and anaerobic components to it. Or we can come in all guns blazing and hit all three targets, aerobic, anaerobic, and neuromuscular. Know how to use the weapons? No problem. Okay, and this is a very busy graph. We recognize that, but this is our overall blueprint. This is where you want to go with your programming decisions. You want to be thinking, what is my context that sits in front of me? There's all the contextual factors we spoke about. How do we want our session to be? Aerobic, anaerobic, neuromuscular, and here's all the different types with different degrees of these different physiological targets, whether it be aerobic, anaerobic, or neuromuscular. They all form these different HIIT types, HIIT type 1 through 6. And the other cool thing is that we're going to learn about this shortly, but we have these different HIIT formats, or these we call them weapons. So we can use short intervals, long intervals, game-based intervals, repeated sprint training and sprint interval training in different degrees to hit these targets when we know how to use them. Okay, and that brings me, I guess, next to learning to use these weapons. All right, so learning to use these formats. And if we have these formats, these weapons in our arsenal, and we know how to use them, manipulate them appropriately to hit our targets, we can be a very powerful practitioner. Okay, so again, in the interest of time, we can only go through this briefly, but let's just, there's many different ways that we can skin the cat, we like to say. So by manipulating the intensity and the duration of the work bout, and the intensity duration of the recovery bout, those are the two key factors. But by knowing how we can do those, we can change the physiological emphasis. Okay, we'll just focus here on the intensity and the duration of the work intervals, but this is where they all sit. So here's your long intervals. I use these a lot with my triathletes. Short intervals, you'd probably want to use these with your football players, and also probably your game-based high-intensity interval training or small-sided games. These ones need to be careful. These ones you need to be careful with the sprint interval training and the repeated sprint training. Notice these are done at the very high end of the intensity bandwidth. Also notice that everything is in the red zone. So here's your critical velocity, critical power, maximal lactate steady state, functional threshold power, whatever you want to call it. Everything is in that red zone, all right? And it's from the red zone bottom, all right, your critical power, critical velocity, all the way up to maximal sprinting speed or peak power, all right? Everything between that tends to be called your anaerobic speed reserve or your W prime. But that is the HIIT range, all right? Notice the velocity of the intermittent fitness test there. So you can use Martin's 30-15 IFT to calibrate your individual players and where they sit, and a highly useful means of calibrating for them. But yeah, you can, and through that, you can calibrate your HIIT sessions accordingly. That's where they all sit. So once we get through and understand how to manipulate these, we can start to create different weapons that we just spoke on. So we've got the HIIT with long intervals. So these are generally HIIT sessions of 2 to 5 minutes of work. Notice that intensity is sitting right around your VVO2 max, and the recovery tends to be 1 to 4 minutes. We recommend mostly passive unless time might be an issue. The short intervals, I'm going to get into those much more in a sec. These ones are our most versatile HIIT weapon for hitting any physiological target that we really want. You can have different degrees of oxidative, anaerobic, or neuromuscular, depending on how you skin that. I'm going to give you an example from football in one moment. We also have repeated sprint training. So these are all out. The cool thing with the repeated sprint training and the sprint interval training is they're completely all out. So you don't have to calibrate them. It's just as hard as the athlete can go. And that would be like for 3 to 10 seconds, as hard as they can go, with 15 to 60 seconds of recovery, and different series of those often as well. Sprint interval training, these are the ones in the health literature often where they're just all out as hard as you can go for 20 to 30 seconds with long passive recoveries. They're very anaerobic and neuromuscular. And then, of course, the coach's choice. This is game-based training. And these are usually long interval type intervals with implementing a game element to them, with decision making and a sport implement, for example. And these ones are a bit less control, but a bit more sport specific. So those are our 5 key weapons. Okay, and again, in the interest of time, we've got to kind of move through this, but we'll just talk about fine-tuning these briefly. So again, the overall, what we teach you in the course is to appreciate that context, choose your physiological target, create your weapon, adjust the weapon, make the final weapon, and implement in the field. And again, having that knowledge gives you a lot of power as a practitioner. Okay, so we're just going to give one example in the interest of time, and that's going to be the short interval. It's direct application in the sport of football. So in these ones, we're talking about 10 to 60 seconds of work, 10 to 60 seconds of recovery is the range. Work interval is a little higher than VO2 max. Notice 100 to 120% of the incremental test score, or 90 to 105% of your VIFT if you use Martin's 30-15 test. Okay, and notice highly versatile. We can get any physiological target that we want, right? Typically, it can be active or passive recovery. The cool thing about the short interval is the clever manipulation of the myoglobin content. All right, myoglobin is like the hemoglobin that sits in beside the muscle. It replenishes very quickly. So in doing so, and by taking a pause, notice we can actually replenish the oxygen store in that myoglobin and make a session not lactate. And that's often what we want as a coach. We don't want a session that's lactate. That's why they're all doing the long runs, because they don't want a lactic session. Well, if you know how to manipulate your HIIT session, you don't have to have a lactic session. Okay, so notice here the 10-second interval versus the 60-second interval. Much less demand on the anaerobic contribution, much less lactic, much less oxygen deficit that actually occurs in that, because of the myoglobin. It's allowing the recovery is allowing for the resaturation. And here's the data actually here from our paper back in 2013, and just showing, notice you have 10-10 or 20-20 second intervals. You can actually be at VO2 max, but with a blood lactate level of sitting around 4. This is amazing. When this was known since the 1960s with Sultan's group from Scandinavia. It's just incredible, the fact that we can be at VO2 max, but still have a lactate down below 4. Okay, so that is a very useful tool to know as a practitioner. So let's see how Martin actually used these in the field. This is published in Sports Performance and Science Reports. That's Martin's journal. It's also on a blog post on the HIIT Science blog. So we're looking here at managing high-speed running load in professional soccer players, the benefits of high-intensity interval training supplementation. Let's see how we can actually use it practically for our soccer players. Let's have a look at Pierre-Henry, kind of going through here. What's going to happen to him? Of course, hamstring injury, right? Whole hamstring. Comes in and hasn't played in many, many days. And of course, goes back to what he knows how to do. He knows how to sprint. Very, very common. We see this all the time. Okay, so what can we do? We have to have good surveillance. We've already heard lots of great surveillance going on. Monitoring of training load is vital, and we see that happening. This is our chapter 8 that we teach in the HIIT Science course, and then we can measure our external load using GPS, of course, and we can prescribe accordingly. And here's, for example, in Martin's, one of the key elements that he monitors is the high-speed running. So here's distance on the y-axis. We have the distance above 19, let's call it 20 kilometers an hour of running. And here's a situation for a player where they are playing regularly, and every time they have a game, you can see a nice high spike in the distance above 20 kilometers, right? And then, of course, there's recovery occurring between the games. Well, what happens here if he is benched, right? This often happens. A coach decides to bench a player. Well, he's not getting his regular dose of high-speed running anymore. So obviously, the acute to chronic workload goes up, in theory, when he comes back, and he's at high risk for an injury. So what can we do about that? Well, in comes the short interval. We know that we can create these short intervals with certain amounts of that black neuromuscular component. No problem. So again, all this data is there from that blog and paper. We come in, and here's the actual, a nice hypothetical scenario that happens all the time. Bench, this is that period there where he was benched, no load. So what happens in here where he's subbed for 30 minutes, we supplement a little bit of a type 1 and a type 4 session. We give him a little bit more neuromuscular component, not selected for this game here. Once again, we input a type 2 and a type 4 session so that we give both the anaerobic, aerobic, and neuromuscular component. On and on it goes, and we supplement what we know the athlete actually needs, and we use our knowledge of HIIT to do that. All right, here's some of the ways that Martin sets up his intervals. He calibrates those. Again, I won't go into detail in the interest of time, but you can go through these papers and see for yourself how that's manipulated. And now here's the old situation where we have the bench player with the warning acute chronic workload for this game. And now look what happens. We completely alter that acute to chronic workload ratio. And it's when he goes back in for the game, it's just business as usual. It's normal because HIIT has been supplemented throughout all of these different sessions. So I'm probably well and truly past time. Apologies for going a little bit over time, but that is HIIT science in a nutshell. Those are our 10 science chapters, 20 application chapters, and yeah, of course, one specific to soccer that Martin himself, who of course works for PSG, he teaches that one. So if you're interested, that is us. Please visit us at HIIT Science. Visit us on our socials. Until the 17th, we have a discount code for the coronavirus situation, 40% off. Use the coupon code HIITScience40. Carlo, thank you so much for allowing me to speak here, and I hope that was somewhat useful for your audience.
Yes. Thank you, Paul, very much. I also would like to underline the importance of high-intensity interval training. I was probably the first one in the world who had this book, because I felt that it was really it should have been a milestone, because I was blown away by your papers, because they are very useful for the practitioner, even in lower leagues, where you have no GPS, you have no technology, you don't have anything, but you can work like not like MacGyver, okay, like building things from scratch, but with a very precise blueprint that you gave us. For example, 10-10. It's not as a 15-15 or 10-20, and so on. I also recommend to my students, some of them are listening, the use of Martin's test, field test, the EFT, the 30-15, which is very useful because it gives you speeds to work on, not only VO2 max. You can work with speed, you can work directly on the field. I would like Paul to go back a couple of slides, if you can, for a question.
Yeah.
Another one, please. Yes, this one. The one with the GPS. One more.
Oh, one more slide.
Yes. No, one more. No, not back. Forward, please.
Oh, forward, sorry.
And stop here, please. The one that is connected with, no, not this one on the bench.
That one?
This one.
Sure.
One is it's a very simple, probably question, but it's important to understand the main thing perfectly. When you are talking about mechanical work, and those number 3, 3, and 12, and in arbitrary units, what do they represent? The number of times that they went through some acceleration or deceleration?
Yeah, I believe so. And this is Martin's work. So we would actually...
I know.
Yeah, I'll have to revert to him. But I do believe that we've got... so this is... You can have a look here. I believe it is the accelerometer work that's looking at there. And because, notice here in this example, where the mechanical work is higher, notice 12 arbitrary units. versus these more straight line or back and forth ones. These ones this is more for your defenders. So there's a different, according to Martin, and from what I understand, there's a different type of neuromuscular strain that we're seeing in his defenders versus his, I guess, more midfielders and forward, right? So he's basically, he'll use more of these, I think it's the groin muscle and other lower limbs that he's trying to create things that are a bit more specific. So less total distance because there's less absolute sprinting, but more this back and forth that's actually being used there is what he is applying, as I understand it. Still a neuromuscular load, but distributed more in the working musculature that the defender will be having to do with the close contacts and the back and forths. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, perfectly. Because on the book, it was written plus 2 meter per square second acceleration, the acceleration and changes of direction. So I thought it was just a counter of the numbers of time when they went over that threshold, and so 3 times and 12 times in the more fatiguing, we can say, if you pass me the word for the muscle, for the neuromuscular and in the joints. I would like to underline this thing as well, that with the same work, 10 seconds at 110% with 20-second passive, you can have a lot of different stimuli. If you go to just on a straight line, like the first one, in which you involve a lot of high speed. On the second one is a different stimuli, because you don't go to that, you don't reach that high speed, and you don't do straight angles, but a lot of just bends. Yes. And the last one, which of course is not the same, you have a lot of mechanical work. So it's very important for us to understand what you were pointing out. The same thing, the same concept can be declined in 3 different, very different types of exercise. 10, 20 can be 3 very different things for us. And this is very important for me, for those who don't have a GPS, like for all the team, as I told you before, lower leagues and things like that, strength and conditioning coaches, or just coaches who can understand what they are really doing on the field without having a lot of technology. So I would like to thank you and Martin for the work done, which is very useful out there in the jungle of the field.
Thank you, Carlo. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having us.